Hello, everyone, and welcome to our next lecture in the URMC 21-Day Racial Justice Challenge. My name is Norma Holland, Director of Public Relations and Engagement for the SMD Office of Equity and Inclusion. We thank you so much for joining us, and we welcome Dr. Jeffrey McCune, the director of the Frederick Douglass Institute in the School of Arts and Sciences at the University of Rochester. His topic today will be Courageous Conversations. Dr. McCune's lecture today is brought to you by the Association of Minority Residents and Fellows, AMRF, and the University of Rochester Medical Center Office of Equity and Inclusion. With us today are AMRF President Dr. Michelle Sainville and Vice President Dr. Gilda Johnson. Thank you so much for being with us. Our ASL interpreters today are Christopher Grooms and Lisa Zalar. Thank you so much for being with us. Our captioner today is Tracy Steele. In order to best enjoy today's presentation, please make sure that your view is on gallery view. Thank you again, and without further ado, allow me to let Dr. McCune have the floor.
Thank you so much, Norma. It's so great to be here and to join each and every one of you on this day. I'm very excited about this month. I've been doing a lot for Black History Month, as you can imagine. And it seems that I never tire of the work that we're doing here. And so I thank you for having me. And I hope that our time together today will be full of a lot of information, but also a lot of fun. I first want to start by saying, for me, the question of the courageous conversation that I want to have today is, what does it mean that Black and queer, for me, are synonymous? What does it mean when we begin to think about Blackness and queerness as synonyms rather than antonyms? What does it mean when we begin to think about Black and queer as a conversation between differences? So for me, what I want to really do today is really take some time to think about, what does it mean to live in a world where we begin to think about Blackness and queerness as not necessarily so distinct, but in some ways redundant, repetitive, synonymous. Historically, we have separated Blackness and queerness because we have led ourselves to believe that the histories of Black people do not include queerness. But what is more queer than being brought to a country against one's will, having one's family destroyed or families destroyed, and not necessarily couples, but having families destroyed, like relationships between your brother and your sister, or relationships between lovers, right? Not necessarily heterosexual, but also queer lovers who were separated on ships. What does it mean, right? That we have this orientation in the world that we call Black, that has historically been treated as queer. And so when we begin to talk about queer sexualities, I have to say that for centuries, Black people, Black women, Black men, Black trans folk, not that those are separate, those are all together, but all of these folks, Black bisexuals, Black homosexuals, Black gay people, I don't say homosexuals, and there's a reason for that, we'll talk about that later. But Black gay folks, Black bisexual folks, Black trans folks, right? All were a part of these moments of American history and subjected to the same violences that so many folks were subjected to. So what does it mean to think about these things as being dynamically synonymous? Today, I wanted to begin by discussing kind of my history of coming to these terms, the ways in which I came to really think about the queerness of Blackness, the ways in which I began my journey as an academic who was studying Black studies and who was often reading over and over again different kinds of treatments of Black people that to me felt very complementary, if we can say that, to the things that were happening to the folks who identified and who understood themselves as queer. Now, this is not to say at any means, right, that I am suggesting that what happens to Black people in the world and what happens to white queer people in the world are synonymous. In fact, this talk will show you courageously that oftentimes white people who identify as queer and or trans occupy and participate in some of the same anti-Blackness that we see in heterosexual counterparts. For me, what's important about creating this relationship between Blackness and queerness is really identifying the ways in which Blackness itself has historically been understood as the queer on American soil. This, of course, for me, anticipates something that we will come to in a few minutes when we talk to my good friend, David Johns. It anticipates the moment when Black people themselves, right, can understand within Black History Month why it is so important that we not only recognize, but also celebrate the lives of Black, actually same gender loving people and Black trans folk. It will become also clear that when we talk about the world in which the great Martin Luther King lived, where he said, injustice everywhere, anywhere is a justice everywhere, right? It will make so clear what it means when Black people themselves, right, participate in forms of violence against trans Black women disproportionately. It will make so clear why it's so problematic that Black queer young boys are made available to violence. It will make it so clear when we start thinking about the relationship between Blackness and queerness. It will make it so much more clear why some of the violences within the omissions of Black queer people from Black history is not only inappropriate, but it advances the conditions under which the value of Black queer life is deemed low and unnecessary. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about my career. I'll start there. And, I began my career writing a book called Sexual Discretion. And the principal argument of that book, right, is a recognition that when we think about Blackness and queerness, right, we can't quite separate them because they show up over and over again as being companions within our world. So Sexual Discretion is a book about Black men who don't identify as, who often don't identify as being gay, who recognize themselves as same gender loving, but who kind of exist in the world as not a part of a so-called gay community. In other words, for many Black people, Black men and Black women, the idea of coming out is understood as insufficient. The idea of coming out actually is understood as unnecessary, right? The language does not make sense because come out to what? To where? And who is rewarded by this? The big major question of my book is for whom is coming out an affordable option? In the world in which we live, the contemporary world in which we live, the idea of coming out is that you sit at a table and you tell someone the biggest secret of your life, or that you wear some flag or triangle that represents liberty in terms of sexuality and or gender identity. The idea of coming out is that there is a table that has been made for you that is comfortable enough that you can identify and recognize yourself with an identity that at no consequence or at some consequence, but that the consequence is always joy, right? So there might be consequences in terms of how people respond to you, but the idea is that when you come out, you feel better. And the men with whom I was working at the early part of my career just did not believe this. They did not agree with it. In fact, many of them said being Black in this country meant being too visible, hyper visible. And the last thing that I want is to be more visible. And so for many Black men, because my population with whom I worked was mostly Black men, I did talk to some Black women who also said the same thing, right? Why would I want to be further marked? Why would I want to be further devalued? Why would I want to be further marginalized? And so for them to, in some ways, mark themselves LGBTQ was to actually make themselves more available to violence, and in some ways more available to anti-Blackness. And so what I wanted to do today was talk a little bit about what that means in terms of our courageous conversations. So much of our time when we talk about LGBTQ folks, we see it with comedians, we see it in the media, is that the dominant narrative around LGBTQ anything is white LGBTQ culture. We assume that what works for the geese works for the gander. And what we've realized is that actually there are very specific experiences that the intersections of Blackness and woman, Blackness and gay, Blackness and lesbian, Blackness and bisexual, Blackness and transgender, that all of those intersections produce new knowledges, new understandings, and honestly, new problems. It's almost like more identities, more problems, right? And part of what the men with whom I spoke knew was that the more in which they articulated their identities, the more problems would come to fore. And so I want to take this moment just to open you to a conversation that my good friend David Johns is having on this term that he calls inviting in. And part of what he gives us is an opportunity to really think about what is the value of coming out in the 21st century.
I would be okay with the idea of coming out if it meant that everyone was expected to come out. But that's not how it works in practice. I've never seen a heterosexual person have to tell their coming out story. My name is David Johns. I'm the executive director of the National Black Justice Coalition, and this is a word about inviting in. Inviting in is a way to complicate what is normally thought about as coming out. For many, coming out is the process by which people sit down with their families, have an awkward conversation about them being LGBTQIA+, and then they're celebrated for it. Often for white people who come out, this also then involves them moving to a neighborhood, a place like Chelsea, New York, or Hollywood, California, or Boys Town, Chicago, where they then get to join communities and sports teams and show up in gay community centers where they draw power from that part of their identity. For those of us who are Black and LGBTQIA+, the idea of coming out is sometimes simply not an option. Most Black LGBTQIA+ people live with other Black people. We are disproportionately concentrated in the South. We live in the states where it is legal to discriminate against us based on actual or perceived sexual identity, gender orientation, or gender expression. We use the term inviting in to highlight the importance of people doing the work to show up as both allies and accomplices, adopting the language that we need to be able to talk about people in asset-based, stigma-free, positive ways to otherwise engage in conversations about things that are important to people. And so for us, the idea of inviting in people means that once you do the work required to demonstrate that you are competent and compassionate, I can share with you, or we can share with you, parts of who we are, including who we love, or other things that you might need to know about our identities. An example of inviting in is my brother Lil Nas X. Many people felt that it was important to talk about Lil Nas X having come out as if there was this singular moment in time in which he had this unique realization about his sexual identity and then decided to stand atop a mountain and decry it to the world for everyone to know. And what I appreciate most is that Lil Nas X says, actually, that's not true. He made clear for anybody that had questions who he is and how he shows up in the world as a Black man who happens to be same gender loving. Words matter, right? Inviting in as a construct is important because it highlights the importance of a bilateral relationship and the need for two people to be engaged in this process of having conversations and making space for each other. I don't owe you an explanation of who I love. However, if you do the work required to learn some language, to leverage our friend Google, and to again think about diverse experiences, then we might be able to engage in this conversation where I will invite you in. And the hope is that if I invite you in, you will invite me in as well, and we can have conversations about things that are important to you, but might otherwise be difficult for you to think about discussing. I have two hopes, dreams, goals with shifting from coming out to inviting in. And one is that we get to a point in time in which it's not necessary for anyone to have to explain or announce or defend their sexual identity, gender orientation, or expression. And more than anything, I hold this dream for our babies. Right now, high school kids are identifying more often as anything other than strictly heterosexual. To be clear, there's no gay agenda. If there is and you've seen it, send it to me. But it is, I think, their way of saying to us that the boxes, the narrowly constructed categories that have existed for far too long, boy, girl, Black, white, things that don't allow for these intersections to exist don't work for them. And so my hope is that we listen to the fact that our babies are screaming for us to do differently, to celebrate humanity, to otherwise find ways to strengthen cohesion so that we can be better communities and a better country. I believe that inviting in will hopefully be a tool to help us get there.
And there you have it. It's always that conclusionary moment. So for those of you all in the medical field, right, it's clear, right, the ways in which something like an inviting in might be very important as you think about the kind of communities and environments that you are creating within your own offices, right? There's a way in which, right, this notion of inviting in creates a space where folks can feel comfortable to talk about their multiple identities, how they choose, but the space has to be made available for that to happen. It's not necessarily the responsibility or should be the onus of a person who is living at the intersections of Blackness and lesbian, or Blackness and trans, or Blackness and gay, that they have to like come into your office and say before you can actually treat them or talk to them in ways that they feel might be affirming, that they have to actually use that language in order for you to affirm them, right? The situation should already be affirming with things on the wall, with the ways in which you ask questions, with the options that are given to them, right? As you talk about sexually transmitted infections, right? You don't talk about them differently amongst different populations. You actually use the same script for all folks, right? So when heterosexual folks come in, right, you ask them, are you sexually active? How many partners do you have, right? Like if that's a part of the conversation or the drill that you would normally use. But don't just do that specifically for Black gay men because you know about the disproportionate rates of HIV infection, right? While that may be true, that entry of conversation might actually be a turnoff to a person who is trying to see a space where they are invited in. Matter of fact, you may be pushing them out more than inviting them in. And what David Johns gives us is an opportunity to really think about how important it is that we begin to really school ourselves on one of the key fundamental differences between white queer folks, right, who of course experience oppression and marginalization vis-a-vis gender and vis-a-vis sexuality and sometimes even vis-a-vis class. That is true. But Black folks who actually have a what we call a dynamic force of oppression, right? Thinking about the multiple kinds of oppressions that they are available to based upon not only race, but gender, sexuality, class, right? Even geography. We have to account for those things. We have to make space for conversations we have to make a space where conversations around those multiple oppressions and multiple barriers are possible. And so part of what I'm asking and what I think we have to do is create a table that already anticipates diversity, that already anticipates folks who do not look like what population you might be serving at the present moment. This is something that I'm very key on in my own kind of activist work, is that we can't just create spaces when the people come to us, but we have to create spaces where the people would come, right? And so part of what I try to do, for example, even within the Frederick Douglass Institute for African and African American Studies, while it has historically been a space that has really touted, right, the work against anti-Blackness, anti-Blackness has not always meant working against misogyny, working against homophobia, and working against subordination based on class. And so what I have to do in my rhetoric, in my website, in my office space, in my own articulations of what the FDI is, or Frederick Douglass Institute is make sure that it incorporates language that already anticipates what I know is to come. So what does the large omission of Black LGBT history mean? Because for some of you, I know you're saying, well, what does it mean if Black people are not inclined to come out? Then how do we actually celebrate Black LGBT history? How do we actually talk about the joys of Black queer life? Well, the first answer is there are a whole bunch of Black LGBTQ people who are out, who are proud, who are available to conversation, right? The problem is that as we talk about the Janelle Monáes and the Lil Nas X's and the Jeffrey McCunes and the everybody else who we know, the Baird Rustins, the James Baldwins, the many trans women and men who are Black and proud. When we talk about all of these folks, we also have to make room for folks who would not feel it an affordable option to come out and pronounce their sexuality and or gender identity. We have to understand that these things are not always available to people, and that in fact, as David made so very clear, might actually subject folks to greater violence. And so for me, I think we can ask the question of Black LGBT history without demanding that we need more people to come out in order to have more Black LGBTQ history. No, we got a whole bunch of Black LGBTQ history, right? And I think that part of the issue is that we're not paying attention, we're not reading, we're not identifying, right? Black LGBT history, Q history. Today's talk, though, is more concerned with our ability to really think that the only way to do recognition is to make things more visible, to make people more visible, to mark people more is the only way in which we can celebrate people more. And that is just the fallacy, the lie of celebration. We can totally celebrate the many people who participated in the Underground Railroad. Why could we not anticipate and celebrate the people who actually operate on the Underground Sexual Railroad, right? Those who believed in the liberation of Black people, right? And found every which way to make sure that Black people were liberated and had opportunities that their white counterparts had. In similar ways, we know that there are droves of Black people, right? Trans, queer, bisexual, right? Who don't announce themselves, but who exist within our communities and make pathways for better possibilities for young and older Black LGBTQ people. And so today, I actually want to celebrate them. I want to lift them up. I want to recognize the people who go unnamed, who live their lives on the low, as we say, who practice sexual discretion and or gender discretion, who do not feel it easy or feel it necessary. It's not always about hard or easy. Sometimes it's just about, I don't feel it necessary for you to know my business. And that is true. Now, this is not me advocating for that attitude that says, I wish all the Black LGBTQ people could do this and be quiet. Because we also know that there's great value in folks speaking their truths and folks speaking their experiences so that we never forget. But what I do want to say is that both things can be true at once. It is also equally valued that we have people in our community who don't find it necessary to tell people their business because they understand the world in which we live is always surveillancing and policing Black people. And so the surveillance and policing of Black sexuality becomes another way in which, right, white dominant, white supremacist societies, right, are given permission to kind of police and manage Black people's lives and way of being. And so that's what we want to stop. So why is this important in healthcare? Why is this important in the worlds in which we live and the communities in which we are engaged? Why do we have to pay attention to these different ways of knowing oneself? Because part of what has happened in our post-civil rights gay liberation movement, which we still are not there. We still have disproportionate rates of Black trans women who are being killed, right, by the police and by everyday folk, right? We still have a disproportionate rate of HIV/AIDS infections amongst Black heterosexual cis women and Black trans folks and queer men, right? We know that these things are still happening, right? But it's important, right, that we begin to kind of take very seriously different ways that people express their identities in different spaces. We have to take seriously the fact that most of our spaces are not conducive. They're made conducive often to the white queer population, all while ignoring, right, Black queer trans realities. And so part of what I am encouraging us to do is think about what it means, right, to take seriously the fact that sometimes in our dominant conversations around sexuality and gender, that whiteness still takes and occupies a predominant space, right? That somehow primacy is still given to whiteness in the ways in which we articulate identities in this country. So in some ways, right, it makes sense, right? White LGBTQ folks grow up in the same communities as white cis folks, right? And so if white cis straight folks are occupying under this idea that our way, right, is the tradition, then when white gay folks create traditions and white LGBT folks create traditions, they come under the same kind of idea that their way is sufficient and should be kind of the universal for all people. But what we know now, right, and what we actually have always known, is that Black queer people do things differently. That Black queer people experience racism and homophobia simultaneously. Black queer women experience racism, homophobia, and misogyny and sexism simultaneously. That Black trans folks experience transphobia, homophobia, racism, and sometimes ableism simultaneously. And so when we know this, right, that means that we have to put our ears to the ground and just be a little bit more careful in terms of how it is that we construct the communities, the spaces, and the organizations that we're building within our communities. Now, before I get to my last point, I would like to invite you to ask Q&A questions. You can put your questions inside of the Q&A. So maybe some of you have already done that. I'm not on the Q&A, but I'm just inviting you. And I think there'll also become a point where you'll be able to ask a question live as well. I only wanted to spend about 25 to 30 minutes kind of outlining some of the things that I wanted to talk about courageously, a conversation that I've been wanting to have with multiple communities, but particularly a conversation that I think is important for this community. So the last piece that I wanted to talk about today was a conversation that I wanted to have with this particular group around what does it take to transform our organizations. And I first want to start with something that sounds very cliche, or maybe people don't think of it this way. Maybe people are always quickly to move to the organization. But I think it requires first some work on the individual. So many of us have learned different ways to understand the world, and some of us still wrestle just with the idea of sexualities and genders altogether. What is this multiple sexualities? What is this multiple genders, right? But then it feels just so complicated when we add race into the equation. So much work we have to do, right? It feels almost burdensome. But the reality is that this is the burden of human life. And in some senses, it doesn't have to be a burden, right? It can really be an opportunity. For the individual, I think it's really time for us to really look introspectively and ask ourselves, why do we think we know what we know? What assures us that our way is the universal? What assures us that the way in which we experience the world is the way that everyone is experiencing the world? And how different could your world be if the world, the family that you anticipate, is one that has queer folks in it? I'll give you one great example. My son and I often sit and have conversations, and he has conversations about television shows. And television shows often presume, right, that there's this kind of like orientation of family, the heterosexual family, one woman, one man, and the children that works. And so when we talk about his future, my child's future, I always talk about his future as whomever he loves. When your partner, right? I'm already anticipating, a world where my son may or may not be a cis heterosexual person, right? I anticipate that. And I think that once we're doing that in our homes, right, it is easier for us to do that within organizations. Part of what I think is important about organizations is that organizations already assume that the folks within your office don't identify the way you do. That the folks in your office, oh yeah, I'm sure everybody's straight here, right? Bad, right? I don't want folks to create dynamics in their office where folks who come into their office can already anticipate violence. That is most important. I'm going to repeat it again. I do not want us to create communities, organizations, institute, offices where folks come into the office and can already anticipate violence. When I look at your form, right, it gives me no option, right, for gender, right? When I fill out the form and it gives me options for racial identity, it gives me no option to mark myself both Black and Latino, right? I want us to create spaces where folks move in ways where they're not anticipating violence, but anticipating possibilities of affirmation, of love, of welcome, and inviting in that could be transformative for those who so often are not invited. I will stop there and I will open this up to conversation. I think someone is going to come on and interrupt me now that I have finished my talk. Thank you so much for being with me and us.
Hi, so we'd like to open it up to any questions. So if you have any questions, you can please drop them into the Q&A. Otherwise, you can also raise your hand and we can unmute you so that you can ask your questions.
I'm going to ask a question of myself in a minute.
We have 2 participants who raised their hand.
Beautiful.
So Victoria Schmidt. Victoria, you should be able to unmute.
Oh, okay.
You're all set, Victoria.
I think Victoria typed her question.
Okay.
Yeah, she did.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm always struck by this question every time I give a talk. It's so interesting. I always get the question, will the Frederick Douglass Institute for African American Studies have as its focus whatever I'm talking about? But I don't get this when I give a talk on Kanye or hip hop, or or if I go to another place and I talk about Black masculinities and the disenfranchisement within the prison industrial complex, right? No one says, right, is this going to be the topics of the Frederick Douglass Institute for African American Studies? But this is actually to my point, right? Because Black people are dynamic people, right? It requires that any Black studies institution has dynamic conversations, right? So the answer to your question is yes. The answer is yes, emphatically, right? If I'm going to actually deal with the community of which I'm serving, right? If I'm going to do the work that is the work of Black studies, that means if I'm going to do the work of Frederick Douglass, right? That means I have to be concerned about the liberation of all people. It can't be that I'm only going to talk about my cis hetero brothers and sisters, right? It can't be that I'm only going to talk about poverty, right? I'm also going to talk about the great contributions of all people that also includes the contributions of joy and liberation that Black queer folks and trans folks give us in our community, right? I mean, it's interesting, right? No one is necessarily, I'm not gonna say no one, but like looking at the numbers of popularity, right? No one is protesting, right? The kind of musical contributions of Black queer folks, because if they were, right, we would have no music.
So Victoria responds, she's asking because we have a massive racial segregation issue here.
Yeah, but it's not an either or, right? And so if you, I mean, this is to the point, right? It's very interesting. The question once again, right? It's not, and thank you for the follow-up, Gilda, but it's not an either or, right? It's not a question of do we address Black people's segregation or do we address Black people's, the fact that Black trans women are being killed on the streets of Chicago, New York, LA, Rochester, San Francisco, Mobile, Alabama, Nashville, Tennessee, Orlando, Florida, Wyoming, Seattle, wherever. I can keep going, right? Like you're not gonna ask me to say, I'm not gonna talk about the importance of those lives, right? As it is equally important for me to talk about Black women's disproportionate violence, sexual violence, right? R. Kelly, right? The traumas that he produced within our communities. Absolutely, right? It's not, so the either or game the zero-sum game doesn't get us anywhere in terms of where we're moving. So I love this as a first question because it actually gets at why so often Black LGBT folks are an unthought. Because we create this hierarchy of oppression that is actually not serving us, right? If in fact the orientation of Black people is to understand that from the beginning we were queer, that our families were never understood as normative. So this whole idea that the Black family is being destroyed, the Black family was never constructed within the US, right? If you're talking about the normative nuclear family, that was never available, right? And so the mythology that the Cosby's ever really existed, right, is part of the quintessential problem of our imagining of Black life and Black people.
Thank you. So we're going to take a question from AJ, who also had hand raised.
Great.
AJ, you
Hi,
should
guys.
speak. Oh, hi.
Hi. I had a question about what you were saying regarding changing the conversation and like how the table is presented. Like we should be assuming inclusion and diversity from the beginning. I think that is something I've always found really crucial in the medical field. Like during assessment and intake, a lot of that information is irrelevant to what we're trying to identify. So I guess my question is, what do you think the best option is? Like, should we eliminate those requirements or provide an option so they can choose to disclose, or changing verbiage? Like, what is the best option, to get rid of it completely or to alter the way that we're doing it?
Yeah, I mean, this is, of course, you know, I leave this somewhat to the medical experts, but I do think that there is ethnographic evidence that both can be true at once. I'm sorry to be that person, but like both can be true at once, right? There are some questions that I think actually are presumptuous, right? Which is like you have a partner, or that you identify in one of the 5 categories, right?
Mhm.
With no option to like put in another option, right? Or to not use that option at all, and the doctor or nurse, when they come in, right, ask other questions that would give us, you know, entry. For example, instead of assuming either or, so for example, if someone is coming in and they have an issue, we did a talk for the medical center a while ago, where it's like, if someone is coming in for a liver issue, right? Deal with the liver issue, right? That's not what we're talking about here, right? We're talking about particular healthcare that is specific to populations of LGBTQ folks, or dealing with, let's say, infectious disease or whatever, right? That these spaces are spaces that often have to engage with the sexual histories of their clients, right? And to do that in a way that assumes only one singular possibility or option, or just 2, right? That you're either straight or gay, right? Is actually inappropriate, right? And so for me, it's both about like, what does the text say, but it's also about how do we supplement the inability for the text to do all the work, right? Because of course, right, if I fill out a form and say I'm bisexual, you don't know what that means, right? Because in this month, I could have only been with men, right? So when you're talking about the actual specific reason why I'm coming to see you is because I'm having some type of apparent bodily function that would usually be identified with an STI, right? In some senses, right, my sex with men won't come out if I just say I'm bisexual, because you're just going to assume that I'm only with, you know, I'm with both, right? There might be other issues that are related to male-male intercourse or female-female intercourse that are very specific, that one has to be comfortable having those conversations. And part of what I think is problematic, AJ, is not just, is the text there, are we having the conversations, but would these be conversations that we would have? And that's why I said the individual has to precede the institution, right? Like the individual has to do some reading and some studying and have relationship. The other piece of this is a real problem, and I'll try to answer every question within 2 minutes, but AJ, you gave me a really good opportunity to make this point too. 65% of white people don't have intimate relationships with Black folks, period. I ain't even talking about Black LGBT folks, I'm talking Black folks, right? So if that is the case, that means that sometimes the language barrier between Black people generally and the medical institution is going to be there. And we need to do some things to increase, right, legibility and intelligibility and ways of understanding Black people in multiple ways, right? Having folks who are in the office who actually work within the community, right? Having, and we're doing this in some spaces, right? Having social workers who do this work to make sure that the needs of different community actors or players or participants are taken seriously. There are folks who are there to do that. But AJ, I really welcome this question and I thank you for asking it. I think it's really complicated, but case by case, one has to determine, are these forms even appropriate, right? And are the ways in which we're talking even appropriate for the clients who we serve?
I appreciate your insight. This is like one of my favorite questions to ask because this is one of my favorite kinds of conversations. I think you're right. I mean, both sides are relevant. Sometimes the information about culture and background and sexual identity or gender identity is important so that we can help them to feel included. And other times it's unnecessary to the medical problem at hand. And so we're just requiring them to divulge information that's not necessary to what we're trying to solve. So sometimes we're re-traumatizing them by asking for all these details that aren't necessary, whereas other times we're ignoring things that totally play a huge role in their case. So I appreciate your perspective and I look forward to having more conversations like this.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, AJ.
So our next question is from an anonymous attendee. That reads, Dr. McCune, you mentioned how Black queer people can be made to feel low and unnecessary in predominant white queer spaces. Can you talk a little bit about the degree of loss those spaces suffer as a result? And it says, as well as Black people.
I want to make sure, I really wish this was a person's name so then I could interpret I'll interpret it how I interpret the question, but I feel like this question could be two ways, but I'm going to interpret it like this. I think that I'm really careful as it's interesting, you know, David brought this up too. I'm really careful not to believe that the reason why we should be inclusive of people is because we need to be thinking about what they can do for us. That has been the position of Black people historically. Once again, right? You're seeing redundancy, you're seeing repetition, right? So the utilization, like what labor, like this is the slave economy, right? Question, right? Which is like, how can Black people serve us? Let's talk about how they would be good in these spaces. They're gonna help us out, right? And the reality is, right, that basic humanity and understandings of humanity means that we value all who exist within the human space. And we figure out how to give value to their lives and their contributions, right? But the contributions themselves are so variant that I'm actually careful not to want to make these kind of hierarchies of contributions. Because the reality is, I'm gonna be honest, for some people, they're not gonna be able to make contributions to certain kinds of spaces, right? One of the things in the med field that has happened historically, right, is always about how we contribute to the research trial, how we contribute to the research experiment, how we enhance what medicine knows about COVID, what medicine knows about HIV, what medicine knows about diabetes and pancreatic cancer, right? All of that is important, but I don't want to make that the individual's responsibility and or a primary contribution. But I do think, to your point of loss, what I do think we lose is a bigger picture of Black community. part of why we have to have this additive conversation around being Black and gay, being Black and trans, being Black and queer, is because we didn't factor Black queer folks in the beginning. That historically we have not factored in Black queer folks. We have not even imagined Black folks like Harriet Tubman as a potentially queer subject, right? We can't even, like my son literally had a question when we looked at Color Me Brown coloring book with my son. He said, is that a man or a woman? And I had to have this conversation with him that I had to, myself, not just him, but I was like, never thought about that. She's always been a woman to me, right? Like my mother said, Harriet Tubman, she's a Black woman. It's important to recognize her as a Black woman. But I think in this isolated moment, it was important for me to actually take a moment to say, what does telling him that Harriet Tubman is a woman mean in this moment? Might this be a moment to talk about gender or not? Right, but we don't often utilize history in the ways in which we could. And so I think that what is lost in this kind of common omission of Black LGBTQ folks and Black gender nonconforming folks and Black trans folks, right, from our history is the opportunity for us to catch up sooner. We're late in the game now, right? We're still trying to figure out like gender pronouns and things, right? We're late, right? Folks have long, right, identified as gender non-conforming or gender variant or different gender identities, right? All of these things, right? They have long done that, and we're catching up, right? Folks have long understood themselves as Black women and not just Black, right? We're like intersectionality, right? And it's like, what did you think people were living like 100 years ago? Anna Julia Cooper in 1910, in the book Voices from the South, articulates, that's 1910, right? Intersectionality, very poignantly. Ida B. Wells, right? I'll just keep going, right? You know, and then not to even mention like the slave narratives that talk about various types of violences, but in those violences, there are also moments where we know there were actual consensual sexual relationships amongst folks of the same sex within and outside of slave contexts. But we never talk about them because that's not important. So that's what's lost. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks,
So
Gil.
the next is from Dr. Robbins. He says, you make sense. The LGBTQ movement has gotten credibility before the Black movement. In quotes, it's okay to be LGBTQ more than it is okay to be Black. Our own electronic health record has LGBTQ correct spaces and language far before correct race identification. Likely because the images of LGBTQ are white forward.
That's interesting. You know, so I'm always careful about the oppression Olympics. I think that doesn't serve us to really think, because it's not true, right? Like it's not true because if in fact there are Black people who are Black and LGBTQ, right? That means there are Black people who are LGBTQ. That means that there are Black people who are left out of the equation of whatever white forward thinking models might be there, right? So at the end of the day, Black people are still suffering, right? And Black people are still not included. But what I do think is right in this comment is that because of the whiteness that is attached to a larger idea of LGBTQ, there's been mobilization in ways that race has not, racialized oppression has not received quite the amount of development or growth, right? Because LGBTQ people, as I said in my talk, right, white LGBTQ people still host anti-Blackness, right? And as long as white people are hosting, white people, including LGBTQ folks who are white, right, are hosting this, we're going to see this real kind of violence, right, in terms of inclusion of Black peoples. But I want to say, right, don't get it twisted. And this is where I think the rhetoric, particularly amongst Black men, are often problematic, which is to assume that LGBT folks, and when they're talking about LGBTQ folks, they're talking about Black LGBTQ folks, right? They're getting more benefits than us. They're getting this more than us. They're getting it, right? Because when my Black LGBT behind walks down the street, I'm not Black LGBT necessarily, right? And so I am often, right, victimized in similar ways as cis Black men and assumed to be such, cis straight Black men, right? Right, and so I feel like we have to be very careful with our articulations of this kind of oppression Olympics, but I do hear your point very clearly, brother, that, Brett, you know, I hear you very clear that this is a concern.
Thank you. So we have about 5 minutes left. I'll read the comments that we have and then take the one final question from Brooke. So from anonymous attendee, we have a comment. We need to start normalizing these conversations. Part of engagement is for us to feel comfortable enough to have open and honest conversations in order to provide comprehensive, sensitive, inclusive care. All people seeking help want help, but also want to feel heard and safe. Thank you for this conversation. And we have another comment. If anyone is interested, The Prophets by Robert Jones Jr. is a fictional account that explores queer relationships during times of enslavement. And we have another comment. John Brown called Harriet Tubman General Tubman. And then finally, we'll take the last question. And if you could keep it to 2 minutes so we could do our closing, because I want to make sure that we end on time for people who have engagements at 1 p.m. Brooke says, I'm overwhelmed by the amazingness of this talk. I really appreciate your perspectives. I'm wondering, as we continue to grapple with the institutional racism inherent in URMC, do you feel we need to continue to investigate and make amends to the community based on Daniel Prude's treatment by our institution? This speaks to how our institution interacts with our neighbors, as well as internal institutional inquisition. So that's everyone's answer in 2 minutes.
You and me were answer in 2 minutes. I'm going to answer this in a way that I think will summate everything I've said today. I think if we can begin to understand Black people as Black queer subjects, if we understand Daniel Prude, Michael Brown, right, Breonna Taylor, right, all of these folks, George Floyd, right, as being queerly treated in the everyday, as being weirdly treated in the everyday, as being made queer, made weird, made obscure, right? Because the reality is that queerness, right, itself announces how it is that other people see us. And it is clear that the police, when they're engaging in violence against Black bodies, they make them into monsters, literally. They call them monsters. In the same way, it is clear that when we talk about trans women and use terms that do not actually represent their gender, we're making them into monstrous beings. It is clear that when we talk about, right, Black gay men and we talk about their femininity or their femininity or their masculinity as being a question and needing to be checked, we are trying to do some things to suggest that the only way that Black men can be is truculent and bigger than life and bear-like and monster-like, that we're trying to trap them within monstrosity discourses and queer discourses. It is clear to me that the institution continues to try to see ways to have a neoliberal treatment of Black people that kind of like gets at one part of the issue instead of the multivalences, the multiple valences, right? The multiple issues that it wants to kind of like hone in on one or two or either or. But when we start really believing and investing in this idea of a Black queer front that is inclusive of all folks, even Black cis folk, then we have an opportunity to really conquer some of the harder questions of this hour. Thank you.
Thank you. Michelle?
Thank you, Dr. McCune, for sharing space with us. We appreciate you sharing your expertise, your experience, and your perspective with us. And to our participants, we hope you found today's lecture motivational and encouraging. We have completed 2 weeks of the 21-day challenge. In week 1, we worked to understand the multiple levels in which racism operates through important topics and concepts, bringing to light the issue of institutional racism, prejudice, and bias. During week 2, we expanded our perspective by exploring the contemporary manifestations of racism in the dynamic and interactive intersectionality of different social categories. Through our daily challenges, we hope you were able to appreciate the ways these categories interact with each other to provide privileges or to create disadvantages for different people. This week, we bring it all together as we engage in courageous conversations. As we continue to push ourselves further to process difficult emotions, and as we share with each other the ways in which we navigate that system on an individual and on an interpersonal level, we challenge you to consider the barriers to achieving health equity in the spaces you occupy as we move from awareness to action. The work of building and maintaining an inclusive, racially equitable culture is never done and cannot be done alone. I'm excited to be taking this journey with you. We encourage you to use the resources on the 21-day challenge main page under the reflection tab as you go through this challenge. And this Friday at noon, please join us for our last debrief and reflection as we wrap up the 21-day challenge. We will have a panel consisting of individuals who participated in the challenge as we explore the principles for and barriers to achieving health equity. The Zoom meeting link can be found under the events link. And so the 21-day racial equity challenge goes through February 25th, as you all know. So be on the lookout for other opportunities for learning throughout the year. And we hope you will continue to join us. Have a great day.
Thank you all.